All right, welcome back to Module 1, Part 4. In this module, we're going to talk a little bit about how we determine the function of behavior. So we're going to take all the information that Don just gave you about looking at the antecedents, behaviors, and consequences, and use it to think about why people continue to engage in the behaviors that they engage in. We're going to start out with the idea that there are two primary functions of behavior. The first is to get or obtain something, and the other is to escape or avoid something. That something could be a lot of different things, but in all cases, if a behavior continues to happen, it is either being reinforced by getting or obtaining a desired activity, a tangible item, attention from a peer or from a teacher, or some other type of stimulation, or that learner is getting to avoid something, something that might be aversive to them, hard work or a cold environment or things like that. So over time, we can tell what the function of behavior is, and we can determine whether or not this behavior is being reinforced by getting something or escaping from something. We determine that by looking at the history of reinforcement. You'll recall that Don talked to us about the idea of positive reinforcement. That is, when we add something to the environment that causes a behavior to continue to happen in the future or to increase in the future. So when that is in place, when there's positive reinforcement that's been connected to a particular behavior, we say the function of that behavior is to get or obtain something. And like we said, that could be a sensory or stimulation. It could be something social, a tangible activity from either adults or peers. When there's a history of negative reinforcement, that is, we remove something from the environment that causes the behavior to continue or increase in the future, we say the function of that behavior is to escape or avoid something. Again, those somethings can be all of the things at the bottom of this chart, something sensory, something social, or something tangible that can come from adults and peers. So the way we do this is by looking at those ABCs of behavior that Don talked to us about. We look at what is the SD, what is the antecedent, what is the behavior, and what is the reinforcement that is attached to that. And by looking at that pattern over time, we're able to determine function. And the key here is you'll hear me keep saying over time. We can never infer function of behavior based on just one example of it. We really need to see a pattern over time in order to be able to determine function. The way we do this is by looking first at what typically comes before a behavior, so that antecedent. What is typically comes after the behavior, what type of reinforcement makes that behavior continue to happen in the future, and then from that we determine the function. So let's look at a couple of examples to help make this a little bit clearer. So let's look at Jonas. When Jonas is asked to complete an independent assignment, he disrupts his peers and refuses to begin. After that behavior, the teacher goes and sits with him and helps him complete the work. In the future, the teacher notices that Jonas continues to disrupt his peers and refuses to complete work whenever he's asked to work independently. So if we assume that this is a pattern of behavior that continues on a regular basis for Jonas, what would you say the function of Jonas's behavior is? Remember, there are two primary functions, to get or obtain something or to escape or avoid something. Which would you say it is? Hopefully you said get or obtain. In this case, it looks like Jonas is continuing to engage in this behavior because he's getting or obtaining teacher attention. Let's take a look at another example. Here's Henry. When Henry's presented with difficult schoolwork, he complains and puts his head down on his desk. Teacher takes his work away. In the future, Henry continues to complain and put his head down whenever he's given difficult work. If this is a pattern that continues on a regular basis for Henry, what would you say the function of his behavior is? Remember your two options, get or obtain or escape or avoid. Yeah, in this situation, we probably would say that Henry, it looks like he's trying to escape or avoid difficult work because he's engaging in this, and what's happening, the consequence that happens after this behavior is that that difficult work goes away. All right, a couple more scenarios just to help make sure this is a really solid skill for you all. A high school teacher is delivering a lesson on music theory. In the middle of the lecture, a student calls out repeatedly. Every time, the teacher calls on the student and allows them to answer their question or share their opinion. What would you say is the hypothesized function of this student's behavior? Hopefully you answered to get or obtain teacher attention. How about this one? A parent asks a child to clean up their room. Kid begins to whine and scream, and the parent says, I don't want to fight this tonight. They give up. The child doesn't clean up their room. What would you say is the hypothesized function of the student's behavior, assuming this happens over time again? That's right. In this case, it's to escape or avoid cleaning that room. During a teacher lecture, Martha calls out repeatedly, doesn't raise her hand, disrupts instruction. Every time the teacher gives her a look, that teacher look and a redirection, or occasionally calls on her. In this case, the antecedent is a teacher lecture, which usually comes with limited attention. You're not getting a lot of back and forth between you and the teacher. What was Martha's behavior? That's right, she's repeatedly calling out during that lecture. And the consequence in this case is the teacher gives her attention, either by looking at her, telling her to stop, or letting her participate in the activity. So in this case, we would say, what is the function of Martha's behavior? She continues to repeatedly call out over time. The teacher is giving her attention, adding something to the environment. And so in this case, we would say the function of Martha's behavior is to get or obtain attention. In this case, attention from the teacher. How about this one? Given a difficult writing assignment, Susanna throws her pencil down, rips up her paper, and puts her head down. The teacher ignores the behavior, and Susanna never finishes her assignment. So we have an antecedent, a difficult writing assignment. Susanna's behavior is throwing that pencil, ripping her paper, putting her head down. The consequence is really nothing, except that she doesn't need to finish that assignment. She never has to complete that work. The teacher doesn't give her any additional attention. So there's a history here, if this is continued over time, of Susanna being able to get away from that hard work. So if we look at that pattern over time, we would say that the function of her behavior is to escape this task. Because there is a history of negative reinforcement where the task goes away when she puts her head down on the desk. All right, in the hallway, Tim teases and trips a student who walks slower, and every time his peers laugh. So let's take a look at this scenario. The antecedent here is he's in the hallway, he's during a transition, there's limited adult supervision, and there are a lot of peers around. Tim's behavior is that he's teasing and tripping another student. And the consequence here is there's a pattern of the peers laughing and sort of patting him on the back and giving him positive attention when he makes fun of this other student. If this is a pattern that continues over time, we would say that the peers are adding something to the environment by giving him attention. And so there is a history of positive reinforcement. And the function of Tim's behavior would be to get or obtain peer attention. All right, so let's try to see whether you can determine the function of behavior on your own. I'm going to ask you to go back to activity 1.9, where you watched the video of Dr. Terry Scott and you identified an antecedent and behavior and consequence chain. And you wrote that down in activity 1.9. Go back to that activity, take a look at that behavioral chain. If you were to assume that that pattern continued over time, what would you say the hypothesized function of the behavior is for that particular student that you noticed? Once you've done that, then try to develop your own example based on something that you've seen in your classroom or in a classroom in which you've been observing. See if you can identify a typical antecedent behavior and consequence chain, and if that were to continue on a regular basis, what would you say the hypothesized function of behavior is? Remember, you have two options when we're thinking about function of behavior: to get or obtain something, or to escape or avoid something. Now that you've tried it on your own, let's go back and review the example that we did together. So you'll recall that we looked at that video of Dr. Terry Scott, and we looked at this particular chain. We looked at a situation where the teacher said it's time to line up for the assembly, and the students were supposed to stop working and line up at the door. One student, though, did not do that. He continued working and did not line up at the door. And the consequence was the teacher asked the student to show him how to line up and then asked the student to go to the door. If this is a pattern that continues each time the teacher says it's time to stop working, it's time to line up, if this same student, Roy, continues to engage in this pattern over time, what would we say the function of this particular behavior is? The consequence that follows is that the teacher is giving him attention. So if this is the pattern that repeats over time, we're going to say that Roy continues to engage in this behavior because it's working for him, because he's able to obtain teacher attention. All right, your next activity is a discussion board post. I want you to step back and think big picture about how understanding the antecedents, behaviors, and consequences, or the ABCs of behavior, helps you think about developing interventions. How does it help you think about placing those behaviors in the context in which they occur? And think about a time when you may have seen what you think might be a mismatch between the function of behavior and an intervention that was being used in a classroom. Think a little bit about classrooms in which you've worked or classrooms in which you've observed. Jot down your ideas in a discussion board post for your colleagues, read through their responses, and respond to some of their ideas as well. All right, and now that you've completed that discussion post, you may find that you still have some questions about how to determine the function of behavior, and you want some additional resources to help you practice identifying the antecedents and behaviors and consequences. If you want to dive in deeper, the resources that are listed here and in your workbook are fantastic resources that give you some sample forms, lots of examples of how to complete this information, different types of checklists, and then some common problem behaviors and usual suspects for function that might help you think further about how to use these tools and these resources going forward. So feel free to check those out.